Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe and explore. The night was colder than usual, but Julian barely felt it. He stood on his apartment balcony, hands gripping the metal railing, eyes locked on the city below. The streets pulsed with the low hum of passing cars, neon lights reflected in rain-slicked pavement. Everything should have looked familiar. It didn't. Something felt off. A subtle flicker ran through the skyline, like a broken signal struggling to hold its shape. The Willis Tower shimmered for half a second, then steadied. Julian blinked. Had that just happened? Or had his mind played a trick on him? He exhaled, shaking off the unease, but then, right in his line of sight, the moon shifted. Not gradually, not like the slow march across the night sky. 1 second it was above the west side. The next it jerked eastward. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers fumbled for the scanner in his pocket. He lifted it toward the sky, waiting for the readout. No interference. No atmospheric disturbance. Nothing that explained what he'd just seen. A sudden gust of wind rattled the street signs below. Papers scattered across the sidewalk. Julian's gaze landed on a newspaper stand near the curb. He wasn't sure why it caught his attention, until he saw the date. July 21st, 1893. The ink looked fresh, the edges crisp, as if the paper had just been printed, delivered that morning. Julian took a step back. His pulse hammered in his ears. No, that wasn't possible. Julian's hands trembled as he pulled his scanner from his pocket. The screen flickered, struggling to stabilize, as if whatever force had shifted the moon was now interfering with its sensors. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, but the numbers on the display weren't making sense. Time fluctuations detected. Stability compromised. He swallowed hard and turned his gaze back to the city. A cab at the intersection began moving backward, not in reverse, not like a driver correcting a mistake. The headlights dimmed as the entire car rewound, its tires rolling in the wrong direction, the driver inside completely unaware. A pedestrian at the crosswalk raised his hand to hail another cab, but before Julian could blink, the man was suddenly 10 steps behind where he had been, repeating the motion, over and over, as if the city had lost track of time and was scrambling to correct itself. Julian stepped away from the balcony and rushed inside, his mind racing. He needed more data, needed to know if this was isolated or if it was spreading. He dropped into the chair at his desk, waking his system with a swipe. "Helix," he said, barely keeping the tension from his voice. A faint hum filled the room as his AI assistant activated. The familiar voice responded, smooth and unbothered. "Good evening, Dr. Henshaw. How can I assist?" "Scan the quantum chronosphere. I need a timestamp check." A pause. A flicker on the screen. Then, error. Timestamp missing. Julian felt the floor shift beneath him. Run it again. Rerunning diagnostics. Error. No active timestamp detected for the year 2045. His pulse pounded against his temples. That couldn't be right. The quantum chronosphere, an unbreakable record of every moment in history, was the foundation of time itself. The past could be buried, rewritten, forgotten. But the present? The present had never gone missing before. Julian tightened his grip on the armrest. He didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to give life to the thought clawing at the edge of his mind. But there was no denying it now. 2045 was disappearing. Julian's hands were still shaking when the message came through. A simple, unmarked notification on his screen. "Meet me at Roosevelt Station. Now. Before it's too late." No name. No sender. Just the location. He hesitated for only a second before shoving his device into his coat pocket and heading for the door. If someone else knew what was happening, he had to find them before the city unraveled further. The station was nearly empty when he arrived, just a few scattered commuters waiting for a train that hadn't come in over an hour. The flickering overhead lights cast uneven shadows on the tiled floor. And then, he saw her. A woman in a worn leather jacket, pacing near the edge of the platform, her fingers tapping anxiously against the side of her leg. She looked up the moment he stepped closer. "Dr. Henshaw?" Her voice was sharp, urgent. She was already scanning the area as if someone, or something, was listening. Julian nodded, studying her. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from lack of sleep but from knowing too much. "Eleanor Vaughn," she said quickly. "I know what you've been seeing. I know about the shifts." Julian's pulse quickened. "What's happening?" Eleanor exhaled sharply. "This isn't new," she said. "Chicago has been unstable before. You ever heard of the 1893 time experiment?" Julian frowned. "That's a myth." "No," she said. "It's not." She reached into her bag, pulled out a tattered notebook. Pages yellowed at the edges, handwritten notes crammed into the margins. She flipped it open and held it out. Julian's stomach clenched as he skimmed the words. Diagrams of temporal distortions, records of missing days, entire streets that had reset themselves overnight, all centered around Chicago. "This was covered up," Eleanor said. "The 1893 World's Fair wasn't just a showcase of technology. It was an experiment, a test to see if time could be rewritten. They built something, a device. And now it's waking up again." Julian barely processed her words before the air around them crackled. Eleanor's body twitched, just once, like a glitch in a recording. She staggered back, gripping her stomach, her breath coming fast. "No, no, not yet," she whispered. Julian reached for her, but his hands went through empty air. For a fraction of a second, she was there and not there, her form flickering like a dying signal. Her eyes met his, wide, terrified, and then she was gone. Not a sound, no trace, just a burned imprint on the floor where she had stood. Julian stood frozen, staring at the scorched mark on the floor. The air still carried a faint charge, like static after a lightning strike. He swallowed hard, forcing his mind to move past the impossibility of what he had just witnessed. Eleanor was gone, but her bag wasn't. He dropped to his knees, fingers shaking as he unzipped the worn leather. Inside, her notebook, the same one she had been flipping through minutes ago. He pulled it out, flipping past hurried notes, sketches, equations that looked eerily close to his own work on time stability. Then his eyes locked onto a name, underlined twice, scrawled in the margins. Project Excision. Julian muttered the words under his breath, testing them. They meant nothing to him. But Eleanor had circled them over and over. A timestamp was written beside it, 4:37 a.m., West Loop. It was the only lead he had. The West Loop was quieter than usual, its streets lined with flickering streetlights that cast long, uneasy shadows. Julian kept his head down as he approached the address scribbled next to the timestamp, a rundown laundromat with a rusted 24 hours sign barely holding onto its hinges. Inside, the place was empty. Machines rumbled in the background, the hum of spinning drums filling the silence. Julian stepped to the back, past the rows of idle dryers, until he reached a door marked Employees Only. A small camera was mounted above it. It whirred, adjusting its lens, scanning him. Then the door clicked open. Julian hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The room was cramped, filled with mismatched monitors and old servers stacked against the walls. A single desk sat in the center, cluttered with wires and coffee-stained note. A man sat hunched over the keyboard, a cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. "Dr. Henshaw," the man muttered without turning around. Julian tensed. "How do you know my name?" The man chuckled, finally looking up. His eyes were sharp, wired with exhaustion. "You're not as invisible as you think." He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." Julian didn't move. "Casper." Another smirk. "Eleanor must have trusted you more than I thought." He leaned back, flicking the cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. "What do you want to know?" Julian tossed the notebook onto the desk, tapping his finger against the words. "Project Excision. Tell me everything." Casper exhaled through his nose, rubbing his jaw. "You don't ask for much, do you?" He reached over, typing something into his terminal. The monitors blinked, pulling up classified files, grainy footage, documents stamped with clearance levels Julian had only heard rumors about. Project Excision, Casper said, is not some accident. It's designed. Government-sanctioned. He turned the screen toward Julian. What you're seeing. The disappearances, the timeline skips. It's not a glitch. It's on purpose. Julian's chest tightened. They're rewriting time? Casper nodded. Not just rewriting. Erasing. He tapped on one of the files, bringing up a list of years, names, cities. Some were crossed out. Others were fading in real time. Julian stared at the screen, heart pounding. 2045 was on that list. Casper didn't ask if Julian was ready. He just slid a small slip of paper across the table, his fingers barely releasing it before pulling back like the information itself burned to the touch. Julian picked it up, unfolding the creased edges. A set of coordinates. No explanation. Just numbers. That's where you'll find your answers, Casper said, voice low. Or lose yourself trying. Julian didn't respond. He was already standing, already pocketing the paper, already feeling the weight settle in his chest. There wasn't time for second-guessing. The old O'Hare terminal was a corpse of what it used to be. Gutted by years of abandonment, its halls stretched out like a maze of forgotten echoes. Dust coated the faded signage, directing no one to nowhere. Julian moved fast, staying close to the walls, his footsteps swallowed by the emptiness. He checked his watch. The numbers glitched, skipping forward, then freezing. The disturbance was getting worse. The coordinates led him to an access hatch near a collapsed service tunnel. A keypad blinked beside it, covered in grime, but still functional. Julian hesitated only for a breath before keying in a sequence Casper had scribbled in the margins of Eleanor's notes. The lock released with a heavy clang. Julian stepped through. The underground passage stretched far beneath the terminal, walls lined with rusting pipes and remnants of outdated tech humming with low, flickering energy. The deeper he went, the more his skin prickled. The air felt wrong, thick, as if the fabric of reality itself had started to stretch too thin. And then he saw it. A chamber, large and pulsing with dim blue light. Cables snaked across the floor, leading to a machine in the center. Tall, metallic, wires jutting out at impossible angles. It looked old, but not just in years. Old in a way that suggested it didn't belong to this time at all. Julian's breath hitched. The machine was on. Barely. But on. He stepped closer, reaching for his scanner. The readings were erratic, numbers spiking and dropping as if the machine was flickering between different states of existence. His fingers brushed against the control panel, tracing the worn-out keys. A crackle of static erupted from a nearby speaker. Julian flinched. The machine was broadcasting something. A voice, warped, breaking apart through layers of time. They know we saw it. The machine must not be stopped. The signal cut. Julian's pulse pounded in his ears. The voice, it didn't just sound old. It sounded trapped. Julian stood frozen, the last echoes of the distorted voice still ringing in his ears. The machine hummed weakly, its glow flickering like a dying ember. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. He stepped forward, scanning the console. A small indicator blinked on the side panel. Access archive. He hesitated, then pressed it. A screen buzzed to life, lines of scrambled code flashing before resolving into a grainy video feed. The image wavered, but the face that appeared was unmistakably human. A man in early 20th century attire, wire-rimmed glasses, disheveled hair, deep lines carved into his forehead. His eyes were frantic, darting off-screen as if expecting someone to burst through the door. Julian leaned in. The man exhaled sharply, then spoke. If anyone is seeing this, I don't have much time. The voice was raw, filled with something Julian couldn't quite name. My name is Dr. Lawrence Grayson. The year is 1893. The experiment has failed. No, worse. We never controlled it to begin with. Julian's fingers dug into the console. Time is not a river, Grayson continued. It is an organism. A living thing. It bends, it stretches, it adapts. But if you take too much, if you tear away pieces, it will retaliate. The screen glitched. A sharp breath from Grayson before he steadied himself. We thought we could erase mistakes, fix history before it happened. We were wrong. Julian's chest tightened. I don't know how much has already been undone. But if the anomaly is still growing, if you are watching this, Grayson leaned in, eyes dark with exhaustion. Then Chicago is only the beginning. The feed flickered. Julian braced himself for the worst. They will tell you they can stop it. They will tell you they have a plan. A dry, bitter laugh. But they're not trying to fix time. A sound off-screen. Grayson's head snapped toward it. His breath hitched. They're trying to keep it from unraveling any further. The video cut to static. Julian's stomach turned. The government hadn't created the anomaly. They hadn't lost control of an experiment. They were patching holes in a reality that was already falling apart. And now, 2045 was next. Julian didn't have time to think. The machine whined beneath his fingertips, gears grinding like bones pressed too tightly together. Every warning light on the panel flashed, screaming at him to stop, to step away, to reconsider. But there was no other way. He reached for the final lever, inhaled once, and pulled. The chamber rattled. His breath caught in his throat as the world around him twisted, not in a way he could see, but in a way he felt. His stomach turned inside out, his bones compressed, then expanded. Then silence. The hum of the machine was gone. Julian staggered forward, his boots meeting solid ground. The air smelled different, wood smoke, roasted nuts, damp earth. It took a second for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, his chest clenched. Towering over him was a white structure, gleaming against the night sky. The Chicago World's Fair. But something was wrong. The lights flickered, not like bulbs burning out, but like reality itself was struggling to decide what belonged here. A vendor's cart at the edge of the walkway split into two, one version upright, selling candied apples, the other overturned, apples rolling across the pavement before vanishing altogether. A group of women in wide skirts strolled past him, their laughter soft and elegant. Then, without warning, they were gone, as if the fair had forgotten they were ever there. Julian forced himself to move. He had minutes, maybe less, before the timeline decided to eject him the way it had erased Eleanor. Grayson's notes. He had to find them. The Hall of Science loomed in the distance, its massive columns casting long shadows under the gaslight glow. Julian kept his head down as he weaved through the thinning crowd. A man selling newspapers shouted headlines about new inventions, his words looping, the same sentence repeated 3 times before his voice cracked and he started again. Julian clenched his fist. The fair was breaking apart. He reached the entrance and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the exhibit hall stretched wide, filled with displays of mechanical wonders. Early electric machines, automaton models, devices meant to predict the future. But Julian wasn't looking for inventions. He moved fast, scanning the booths, the walls, the tables filled with scattered blueprints and research notes. Grayson had been here. His work had to be here. A flicker in the corner of his eye made him stop. Near the back of the hall, a glass case blinked in and out of existence. Julian took a cautious step forward, his heart hammering. The case fought to exist, its edges unstable, shifting between solid and transparent. Inside, scattered pages. Handwritten notes. Julian reached out. His fingers barely grazed the glass when the entire room lurched. The fair itself glitched, and Julian felt it, the unbearable sensation of a moment being rewritten beneath his feet. Julian barely stayed on his feet as the fairgrounds twisted around him. The moment passed, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. He had wasted too much time. The pages inside the flickering glass case were his only lead, but if they disappeared before he could get to them, a hand clamped down on his wrist. Julian twisted, ready to fight, but the grip only tightened. "Not here," a voice hissed. A man, older than Julian expected, pulled him into the shadows behind a row of exhibits. His suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked, but it was the look in his eyes that stopped Julian from resisting. Recognition. Grayson. Julian swallowed hard. You know who I am. I know why you're here, Grayson said, his voice low, urgent. And I know you're running out of time. Julian glanced over his shoulder. The hall was still shifting in places, entire sections flickering like bad reception. Your notes? Forget the notes, Grayson snapped. They won't help you now. Julian tensed. Then what will? Grayson's jaw tightened, as if the words themselves were dangerous. The Echo Core. The name settled in Julian's mind like a weight pressing into his skull. He had never heard it before, but something about it felt wrong. Like it had always been there, lurking just out of reach. Grayson dragged a hand through his graying hair, exhaling sharply. It wasn't supposed to work this way. We built it to store timelines, a way to preserve alternate realities instead of letting them collapse. But it wasn't enough. The system kept pulling more than it could contain. Julian clenched his fist. Then why not shut it down? Grayson hesitated. Because the people funding this didn't want to preserve time. They wanted to erase it. The room felt colder. They saw what was coming, a war worse than anything history had seen. The kind of war that doesn't end with survivors, only consequences. Grayson's gaze darkened. They thought if they deleted enough of the past, they could change the outcome before it happened. Julian shook his head. That doesn't make sense. If they could erase entire futures, why is 2045 still unraveling? Because they didn't rewrite history. They broke it. Grayson took a step closer, lowering his voice. The Echo Core is still active. It's buried beneath the fairgrounds, running on whatever fragments of time it's still trying to hold together. But it's failing. And when it collapses completely, Julian didn't need him to finish. He already knew. When the core collapsed, it wouldn't just take 2045. It would take everything. Grayson moved fast despite his age, leading Julian through a series of hidden tunnels beneath the fairgrounds. The deeper they went, the harder it was to breathe. The walls weren't just damp. They pulsed, like something just beneath the surface was shifting in and out of existence. The air crackled. Julian's watch glitched again, the numbers scrambling before resetting to midnight. Time wasn't just slipping here. It was resetting itself over and over. Ahead, Grayson stopped at a rusted metal door, panting. He pulled a key from his pocket, but his hands shook too much to fit it into the lock. Julian took it from him, turned it, and pushed the door open. Inside, the chamber stretched wider than he expected, filled with machinery that looked both ancient and far ahead of its time. Cables coiled like veins along the floor, connecting to a structure in the center of the room. The Echo Core. It hovered above the platform, suspended in an energy field that pulsed in uneven wave. A machine meant to hold entire realities inside it. But it was breaking. Chunks of the past flickered in and out around it, images of people long gone, buildings that had never been built, fragments of different histories that had nowhere left to go. Julian swallowed the rising nausea in his throat. It's worse than I thought, Grayson muttered. It's not just erasing anymore. It's collapsing the pieces it couldn't hold. Julian took a slow step forward. How do we stop it? Grayson's voice was hollow. We shut it down. Julian didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He already knew what that meant. Shutting it down would restore the timeline to its natural state. The distortions would stop. The past would fall back into place. But so would the war. The one the government had tried to erase before it started. The one that had been so catastrophic they had gambled with time itself just to undo it. Julian clenched his jaw. If he did nothing, 2045 wouldn't exist long enough for any war to happen. But if he shut the core down, billions of people would be forced back into a history that had been erased for a reason. His hands curled into fists. There was no third option. He stepped onto the platform, past the last flickering images of a world that had almost been lost forever. His fingers hovered over the manual override. He heard Grayson exhale, a breath that sounded too much like relief. Julian pulled the switch. The Echo Core shuddered. The pulsing light surged once, then silence. A wave of energy rippled outward, and Julian knew before he hit the ground. The timeline had reset, and the war was coming. Julian's eyes snapped open. The ceiling above him was smooth, white, unfamiliar. His breath came fast, his body stiff like he had been asleep for days. He turned his head, blinking hard against the artificial glow of overhead lights. He was back. The quiet hum of traffic outside told him he was in Chicago. The air smelled like rain, the distant scent of burning fuel clinging to the wind. But something felt off. He pushed himself up, wincing as a sharp ache ran through his skull. His watch read April 17, 2045. The date was right. The year was intact. But the city outside his window, it wasn't the same. He moved toward the glass, pressing a hand against the cool surface. The skyline stretched before him, familiar yet wrong in ways he couldn't place. Buildings he had known his whole life were still there, but their logos were different, their designs altered. Digital billboards ran advertisements for brands he didn't recognize, their slogans written in a font that didn't quite match his memory. Julian's stomach twisted. He turned back toward his desk, grabbing his tablet and pulling up the news. Headlines scrolled past in sharp, efficient text. Most were meaningless. Market trends, political disputes, but then one caught his eye. Classified incident at lunar facility, military AI malfunctions. His throat went dry. He tapped the article. The words blurred together, his mind working faster than his eyes. A top-tier defense system had gone rogue, its decision-making matrix corrupted. High-ranking officials were already locked in emergency meetings. Military action was on the table. Julian's fingers tightened around the tablet. The war hadn't started yet, but it was coming. A soft chime broke through his spiraling thoughts. A message. Meet me at Roosevelt Station. Urgent. His breath caught. That was her message. The same one from before. Julian turned sharply, grabbing his coat and racing for the door. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He needed to see for himself. The station was just as he remembered. Crowded, humming with movement, the scent of coffee and damp pavement thick in the air. He scanned the platform, his pulse hammering. And then there she was, Eleanor Vaughn, standing near the edge of the platform, scrolling through her phone, her face calm, alive, untouched by the panic he had last seen in her eyes. Julian exhaled sharply, his body sagging with something that should have been relief. But then she looked up. Their eyes met, and there was nothing, no recognition, no flicker of familiarity. She held his gaze for a second, then turned back to her screen, oblivious. Julian felt his chest tighten. The city was here. The people were here. But this wasn't the same 2045 he had left. Julian's breath was slow, measured, forced. His fingers hovered over his phone's screen, but his mind barely registered the movement. Eleanor was gone. Not physically, not in the way he had seen before, but gone in a way that mattered more, like the timeline had wiped away any trace of their connection, reshaping her into someone who had never stood beside him, never chased the truth, never disappeared into nothing. He turned, pushing through the crowd, his steps unsteady. The city moved around him like it always had, like nothing had changed. But everything had. His phone vibrated. He stopped. A new message. No sender. No number. Just a single line of text. The timeline rejected your choice. History is course-correcting. You have 72 hours before they find you. Julian's throat tightened. His fingers clenched around the device. Who sent this? Who was watching? The government? The same people who tried to erase history? Or was it something else? Something the timeline itself had created to fix what he had broken? A low rumble reached his ears. Distant, steady, growing louder. He turned his head. A convoy. Black, armored, moving fast. The kind that didn't belong on city streets unless something had gone very wrong. Julian's pulse hammered. He took a slow step back. Then another. The lead vehicle's lights flared against the pavement. Then, in the sky above, the moon shifted. Not in the way it moved with the earth. Not in the way it was supposed to. It jumped. A fraction of a second. A flicker. Julian's breath hitched. The convoy was closing in. And he ran. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.